here and one of the co-chairs. Oh, and even better, we'll start recording this. And thanks everyone for joining us. Um, and I'll turn it over to Jael, who is co-chair of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, which is part of the Vermont Climate Council. And she's going to kick it off in terms of this initial content, talking about the Climate Council process overall and the subcommittee in particular. So Jael, over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jael Polskamp. Thanks for joining us today. So I co-chair the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. And for those of you who don't know about the Climate Council or the Global Warming Solutions Act, the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed in 2020, and it set goals for us to meet our greenhouse gas reductions. And, the act requires Vermont to reduce greenhouse gas pollution to 26% below 2025 levels by 2025. And then emissions would need to be 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% below by 2050. And so out of the Global Warming Solutions Act, they created the Climate Council to kind of come up with this plan to figure out how we can meet those targets. And the Climate Council wrote the Climate Action Plan in 2021, and now we are updating that plan, which is due next July. And so the Climate Council has separated into a bunch of subcommittees, and then those subcommittees, now the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee has separated into task groups. But just to give you a little more update on kind of the process. So we spent the spring and summer orienting the new subcommittee members and starting the work. And then we're spending the fall going through all the pathways and strategies and actions. So for the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, we have 8 different pathways, a bunch of strategies, and 150 actions that we need to reduce, combine, and consolidate. And so that's the process we're going through right now. And then this winter, we'll kind of compile all those recommendations and then start drafting the plan again, the updated plan in the spring of 2025. So part of that process is taking all the input, the public input, and using that to help kind of guide the subcommittee work in terms of determining what actions to prioritize. And then so the next slide, you can see kind of the goal of our subcommittee. The focal area is to look at the role Vermont's natural and working lands play in carbon sequestration and storage, climate adaptation, and ecosystem and community resilience. And then we've broken that work up into the 3 task groups, which is the greenhouse reduction and sequestration task group, looking at how to support adaptation, viability, recovery, economies, and workforce for those who are in the ag sector and forest sector. And then the last task group is the climate resilient land use practices. And so today we're focused on looking at how to reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon sequestration, supporting adaptation and economic viability for farms, and promoting climate resilient practices in Vermont's agriculture sector. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Patch. He's involved in the first task group, and he will walk you through kind of a broad overview of what that group is working on, kind of the targets and the strategies and pathways from that group.
Great. Thanks so much, Jello. I really appreciate it. Our task group is tagged with putting together, as was mentioned, the pathways, very high level buckets, strategies, kind of more focused, examples of what's part of the pathway, and then actions, the specific programs, practices, what have you, that help implement the goals of the pathway, what have you. Anyway, so starting with this slide here, what we're going to talk about are some of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural operations that are tabulated and counted in the state of Vermont's greenhouse gas emission inventory, for which the Global Warming Solutions Act set those reduction targets, as Jael outlined in her introduction. And so in crafting pathways, strategies, and actions to address the goals of having less CO2 in the atmosphere, agriculture is one of those sectors that can both reduce emissions from the source to a point, but the larger opportunity in agriculture is the role the land base plays in sequestering carbon in the soils in Vermont. And we've got good soils and good farmers that can help achieve that. So to break down kind of the 4 areas of emissions, the first one is going to be from our ruminant animals, so cows and sheep and goats, as part of their digestive process with their 4 stomachs to break down cellulose, right? They belch a lot of methane. And so methane is a potent greenhouse gas, which is part of the biological process of a cow making meat, milk, or using it for animal traction. And so one of those emissions from a cow is enteric fermentation. Out of the back end, we get a lot of manure, which has a lot of nutrient value to it for growing crops, as well as organic matter, which can help feed the soil biology. But the storage of that manure can have emissions. If manure is dropped on pasture, there are no storage emissions. But if you put manure in a manure pit, you're going to have off-gassing, generally depending on the type of storage and the duration it's there, as well as some of the weather conditions. So we got to look at how manure is stored. The other is agricultural soils, the growing the crops for the cow, or humans, what have you, food and fiber. But I say cow because the largest source of emissions from ag soils is the manure that is applied to the soils. Much smaller components include legumes like alfalfa and nitrate losses, and then crop residue as well. And then the smallest portion of ag emissions is tabulated for Vermont is synthetic fertilizers. About 2% of Vermont's agricultural greenhouse gas emissions come from liming and urea fertilization. And to break down the other sources, about half is from enteric fermentation. So a very large source is the cows themselves and that biologic process. And then the other 2 are broken down roughly, call them a quarter, right? 25% manure storage, 25% ag soils. So that's 102%. Well, it's 26 and 23 and 49. But to roughly round, enteric fermentation is the largest, then manure storage and ag soils together, and then synthetic fertilizer at the end. And we don't have to buy a lot of fertilizers in Vermont, unlike the Midwest, because we have these cows that produce a lot of manure, which farmers then use to grow crops. So those are the sources. And so to identify those practices that farmers may already be utilizing or could further adopt or extend the amount of management they apply on their farm, we looked at what are some different agricultural mitigation strategies that are available to address these emission sources. And we've broken them down roughly into these 5 categories. Feed management, so type of feed that goes into a cow, grazing opportunities, any nutritive additions that could be made. Seaweed was a big one folks were looking at for a while. So those are some controls that can be used in enteric fermentation. But to just remind ourselves that biological processes that undergird a cow means there is a lower limit at which you just have to acknowledge that cows are going to belch methane, and that's part of how we turn all of this grass into useful food products
All good there, Ryan?
Did we lose Ryan?
Oh, it could be he was signed on with his phone. It looks like it dropped off. I'll give him a second. Ryan, just let us know when you're back. Um, so as Ryan was doing, he was walking through this slide, and we've got two more slides related to these issues. And once Ryan gets back on, why don't we just stay here for 1 second? And Jael, I know you've been a little bit involved in this work, but let's give Ryan just a moment. But you can see on this slide some of the pieces that are in the existing plan that are part of the update conversations. It's one of the key pathways that Ryan's going to get to when he gets
All
back on.
right, David, I'm back.
Yeah.
All right,
Great.
sorry about
I
that.
just sort of
Haven't
moved
had
you
a
ahead to
drop
this
call.
slide, if that's okay.
Yeah, whatever, we can skip over the mitigation stuff. All right, so pathway 10, this just breaks down some of the examples of practices that can be adopted by farmers that can have a beneficial effect on either reducing the amount of emissions from those tabulated sources, or can increase the rate of sequestration in the soil through the process of photosynthesis and the growing of crops in our soils. So if we're looking at those strategies, we know that the less you till a soil, the less you disturb that soil biology, the greater opportunity you have to sequester carbon in the soil. So reduce tillage and increasing vegetative cover, stuff growing all the time, cover crops, those are the core components of improving soil health, and some of the top recommendations and some of the most effective and cost-effective practices that farmers can implement. Grazing management, grazing practices are another example of a very effective management that addresses not just manure storage, but also feed management. And so identifying management intensive grazing and more intensive grazing management that can be done is another example of a strategy a farmer can adopt. Nutrient management is always an important part, whether it's for water quality or prioritizing increasing organic matter in soils. Making sure nutrient management is happening is a big part of overall farm management. In those areas where farmers are not farming, so buffers or wet areas they don't want to farm anymore, there are options for planting woody stems, whether that's a CREP buffer, which farmers can implement through a state-federal partnership. Their USDA NRCS is the largest funder of this, but agroforestry and silvopastoral practices are some of that USDA NRCS fund, and can be a great way to integrate woody biomass, which does sequester a lot of carbon, with agricultural production. The state of Vermont has equipment programs that we can fund the technologies to get the...
Sorry, Ryan, we were just connecting your phone to you, and you'll need to unmute yourself one more time. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Now you're
Can you hear
connected.
me?
Yeah, you're good. Thanks.
Great.
Yep.
So in the manure management space, how the manure is stored is a big thing, and so collecting the biogas and using that for anaerobic, creating electricity through the process of anaerobic digestion is something that we've been looking at. There are 4 new projects that are scheduled to come online in the next couple of years, and that's new projects that have come about since the passage of, or since the initial climate action plan was published. All right, I'm going to skip to the next slide, if that's all right. Then thank you. Okay, so these are just some other examples of ways to get these management practices to be part of the calculus of how farmers farm, and ensuring that they have a nexus to climate benefit. So making sure we are counting all the benefits that are derived from agriculture in the mitigation and sequestration space, and so making sure that the practices that do have a positive emission reduction coefficient and sequester carbon in the soils are accurately counted and tracked as one of the top priorities, because we want to make sure to give credit to those practices and those farms that are absolutely providing an emissions reduction benefit. Payment for ecosystem services is something that is a unique concept in Vermont. It's not a unique concept generally, but how it's applied in Vermont is very narrow and specific. It is about once farmers exceed a base level of management, providing additional economic incentive for a reward for achieving those standards. And so the newly launched Vermont Farmers Ecosystem Stewardship Program, CSP Plus, making sure that programs like that are available for farmers is a recommendation as well. Food waste is always a big question, less that something a farmer can control, but certainly an area of exploration that we need to look further at. And then I'm just going to make one more comment before passing it on. This is something that kind of undergirds or, kind of goes through all these different sub-task groups, is, acknowledging that farmers are absolutely, affected by climate change. Some studies show, 60% of all climate damage in the world will be borne by farmers throughout the world. And so that we have had two, very significant climate disasters, both in July, both, basically a year apart, just underlines the fact that if agriculture and farmers are going to be able to be here to not only provide the food we need locally, but also to provide these environmental and ecosystem service benefits that the state of Vermont and partners need to make sure there are robust systems of indemnity and ways to support farmers to recover from the climate impacts that they are going to experience, likely more than any other sector. So I just wanted to share that framing. You don't see that directly embodied in these slides, but just to point out, if we want farmers to continue to provide those benefits, we're going to have to come up with some better programs to make sure that farmers can recover effectively after climate disaster. So that's our brief overview. Appreciate the opportunity to share. Thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. Really helpful. So that's one task group, one area that's directly relevant for farming and agriculture. The next area, JL, who's going to give us a little overview on the sort of support the adaptation, viability, recovery, and economies workforce?
That's going to be Jake Claro.
Great, Jake. So away you go.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, hi. So just to introduce myself, Jake Claro. I'm the Farm to Plate Director at the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund and a member of the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee. And myself, Stephen Leslie, and Alyssa White have been working in a task group to look at and prioritize strategies and actions that are related to supporting adaptation, viability, recovery, economies, and workforce. So quite a large span of different approaches. And I think the primary thing to note about this is, when we're thinking about our state's ability to meet its sequestration, storage goals, to be climate adaptive, and to have resilient ecosystems and communities, that really relies upon viable farms, viable forestry operations, and with that also requires that we are supporting those sectors, the economic development of them, and their workforce needs. So that's the thinking around having this as kind of a priority area of attention for this subcommittee. So yeah, I think with that we can go to the first set of pathways. So yeah, again, we're looking at a number of different areas in order to support adaptation, viability, recovery, economies, and workforce. And the first is really looking at the technical assistance and support system, and how do we both deliver or provide trainings to farmers, foresters themselves so that they can incorporate adaptation planning into their management, but also how can we enhance the technical assistance provider network that's has a lot of touch points with farmers, forest businesses, and that would include things like increasing support for UVM extension or farm and forest viability, and the various ways that those programs are providing services to not only farms and forestry operations, but also to landowners and potentially municipalities. The second pathway there is a set of strategies that revolve around the economic viability of both the farm and forest sectors, and really empowering those who are in those sectors to enhance their viability, give them the tools and support to make informed decisions that can increase resilience and adaptation to climate change. So that includes looking at supporting enhancing local food markets, so thinking about market development and providing outlets for what those operations are producing, so that they can be economically viable, and enhance in turn their mitigation and resilience benefits that they provide to Vermonters. That also looks like fostering partnerships at the state, federal, nonprofit, private sector, to build strategies for landowners to address climate change, enhance community resilience. And it is also includes expanding funding for our programs that that enable farmland access, or farm and forest land ownership, conservation, and really trying to leverage that funding to increase land access, and potentially developing new ownership or financing mechanisms. And I think also what we're thinking about related to that particular strategy is also providing emergency relief funding to our farm and forest sector. Ryan had mentioned, and many of us are clearly aware that the last 2 years have been really hard on landowners and on farms and forestry operations, considerable damages, and we don't have a state mechanism right now that is predictable and stable and can really deliver relief in a rapid way. And so that would be one particular area that we're looking at as something to elevate in the next climate action plan. Next slide. So the next pathway focused around economies is, I think, further developing this idea of we need strong local and regional markets, both for the viability of these farm and forest businesses, but also that in turn provides greater resilience to the region, to the state. As much as we have seen certainly impacts of climate change here in a local context, we know that there's a lot of disruptions happening globally with supply chains, and that will only get worse. So how do we really develop a suite of support and programming and policy that can create really strong markets for our producers in the state and local, or the local and regional context, and that takes a variety of forms, from looking at supply chains and providing adequate investment and resources for infrastructure development, and ensuring too that infrastructure is climate resilient. That's ensuring equitable access to local foods and culturally relevant foods through various programming, including things like farm to school. And actually we have that last bullet around developing a food security and sovereignty plan. So we actually do have a food security roadmap that has been created, but there are still some additional elements to that would be helpful to accomplish in terms of mapping and understanding sort of vulnerabilities of certain regions, and also existing sort of assets around climate resilience that we could look to enhance. And then the last, I think this is, maybe we have one, we have one more slide. So then lastly, education, and this is really tied to also workforce development, is a number of approaches that would look to integrate climate-related education at all levels into our education system, into our technical assistance programs, and the last bullet there related to the language in Vermont agencies must be reviewed and updated to be more equitable, speaks to the use of language that is tied to historical harms and injustices that have been committed in Vermont, and really understanding how that language use can potentially turn people away from resources, can cause people to relive those harms. And so periodically reviewing that language, making changes, but also looking to do outreach and education around terms that are replacing those words so that we really understand, why we're using why we're using new language, why we're attempting to make these changes, and facilitate adoption of different language that is potentially more welcoming and recognizes the historical context more appropriately. So those are the major buckets of our task group.
Thanks, Jake. That's great. We got one more task group to go, which is around climate resilient land use practices. And again, today we're talking about agriculture, and tomorrow evening there's another one where we're really going to focus in on land and forestry. But these are relevant for our agriculture conversation as well. Can I just, JL, who's going to step up and talk about these?
Well, I think Andrew's on the call.
Okay, great.
I was going to try and give a good overview, but the task group members have a better grasp of it. So Andrew, are you willing to jump in?
Hey, Andrew.
Hi there.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
We've got a couple slides here, and if you want to help out with them, that'll be fantastic.
I can try to do that.
And we can tag team with JL and you as needed.
Okay.
Do you
want to start? Have me chip in?
How about, Andrew, if you want to take a look with Evan, we've tried to put these on a slide, what you were presenting the other day in the subcommittee.
Sure. So this third subgroup is working on climate resilience land use practices. And as Jael and David mentioned, a lot of that's pretty focused on forests, forestry, and restoration, and natural lands, management of natural lands. But there is also within this subgroup some focus on agricultural practices and agricultural land and the role of agricultural land in mitigation and as well as resilience. And so these are some of the examples of pathways in this group that address the agricultural component or agricultural lands. And the first really is about this broad category of technical assistance. What technical assistance is needed, not just for farmers, but for today's purposes, really for farmers and other land and water caretakers is actually the term we came up with, managers and landowners, and those that are also have another role in caretaking the land in order to really think about climate adaptation, forest management practices, and I think this could also apply to agricultural lands. And as part of this technical assistance, this includes educational materials, outreach, and working with universities, also working with municipalities, and really helping to bring to the table a diversity of perspectives. I should mention other subcommittee members that I work with. Judy Dow and Earl Hatley are doing an amazing job on the subcommittee and are very much focused on bringing a diversity of perspectives to the table in our subcommittee and also in this process as we go forward. And then really the other part of this is monitoring the effectiveness of this technical assistance. And then another major theme underneath our subcommittee is nature-based solutions, really letting nature do the work of providing mitigation and resilience and adaptation, or helping nature do that through restoration and enhancement. And for this and the other actions and strategies under our subcommittee, we really wanted to emphasize that when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about this from a broad perspective that incorporates not just our traditional Western science, but the term that we're using is it actually braids in traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge into those efforts. And you can see that is related in that listed action there to bring that approach towards climate assessments and planning efforts and prioritization frameworks for farming and forestry and land conservation. I think that's it for that slide. And then this is probably very appropriate here. It is very appropriate for agricultural lands. You know, how do we manage natural and working lands for biodiversity, forest health, water quality, and climate resilience? And you know, in our work as a task group under this subcommittee, you know, really think about this as the opportunity to have these natural and working lands that are restored and managed such that they can achieve these multiple goals for climate change. They can sequester carbon, but if they're done right and they're done in the right places, they can really help enhance ecologically connected lands and waters that are supporting biodiversity, forest health, working on water quality through things like riparian and floodplain and wetland restoration, and increasing climate resilience. So that is a sort of that certainly applies to how what Ryan talked about in terms of the practices that you would undertake on agricultural lands would be a really important part of that. And the next one down, I also mentioned nature-based solutions already. This one just focused on their role in increasing resilience. Don't need to remind this group about the importance of doing that in the face of increased, more intense and more frequent flooding, and also potential for droughts as well. How do we do that? How do we increase natural systems to be able to increase resilience through promoting these healthy corridors, floodplains, and wetlands? And you know, an example of that is supporting education around riparian buffers and floodplains to help increase the amount and the strategic location of those activities. And another aspect of this is really thinking about, I mentioned strategic conservation. Those of you that are familiar with the federal Conserving and Restoring America the Beautiful, which I worked on for many years, really focuses on conserving 30% of lands and waters by 2030, and doing that strategically through thinking about, you know, what are the key networks of core areas and corridors and lands and waters that can best help us conserve biodiversity into the future and increase climate resilience. So how do we use our best available information to do that, to come up with a portfolio of conserved agricultural lands and other lands that fit together in a landscape design? We're fortunate in Vermont to have a landscape conservation design framework to work with, and a 30 by 30 working group to work with that can really guide not just conservation of land and how it fits together with agricultural land and how conserved agricultural land is part of that, but where we do that and how it fits together. And then a more specific subgroup here is, or sub action here is to, when we're really thinking about renewable energy generation, that we're being smart about it and we're not doing it in places that are going to impact our natural and working lands, but are actually in places like parking lots and buildings, where there isn't any impact on the natural land. So really pushing things in that direction and not taking up huge agricultural lands or natural lands through solar panels or wind energy generation.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. And thanks, everyone. I think, so we took a little more than a half hour, and thanks for your patience, everyone. But I think it's important to look at that content that this subcommittee is working on, trying to wrap its head around how to update the climate action plan, which pieces are going to need to get emphasized in this next iteration, the next set of years. Okay, so this is the moment where we are going to have a conversation about it. You can see the questions that we're trying to inspire you with. Before we do this, and thank you, Molly, because that's exactly what I want folks to do, is raise their hands. Before we do it, I'm going to do a quick thing, which is I want to see who's in the room, and we can go ahead and drop the slides right now. I'm interested who's in the room, and Charlotte's going to throw up a quick Zoom poll. If you can just take it quickly, it's just trying to get like what best describes your affiliation. So if you're a farmer or you're in the ag sector, click on that. If you're a forester in the forestry sector, click on that. If you're in state, local, federal, or tribal government, click on that. And you can see up below as well. So just take a quick moment. It'd be really helpful if we just dive into this. Thanks, everyone. I'll have Charlotte just keep it open for another 10 seconds here. And if you're interested in making a comment or answering some of those questions we put on the screen, you can do exactly what Molly did, which is raise your hand, and we'll use the Zoom raise hand function to get our attention. All right, let's go ahead and share the results of who we have in the room. Are they sharing? Okay, great. Thanks, Charlotte. So you can see we've got farmers in the room, people in the ag sector. We've got a lot of government folks in the room. We have some environmentalists in the room. And I look forward to the conversation. There's probably, I should have done an other. Sorry, but there's some others in there as well. One other thing before we do, if you are a member of this subcommittee, can you just sort of like wave your hands for a second? Like, hey, I'm on the subcommittee. I know Billy's here, Jael, Jake, Stephen, Andrew just turns the camera off, but thanks. So we have members of the subcommittee here who can help in our conversation. All right, so Molly, thanks for being patient. Love to hear what you have to say. And folks, if you want to introduce yourselves, that's a great thing to do too.
Thank you, David. I'm a faculty member, professor of food studies at Middlebury College, and I'm also a faculty affiliate at the Institute for Agroecology at UVM. And that's one of my questions, why you aren't talking about agroecology in climate resilient land use practices in particular, because there's a thriving institute, it's growing. It already has a large number of people affiliated with it that's already braiding together this traditional Western science with traditional and indigenous knowledge. So that's one question. I really think you need to include support for agroecology. A second question has to do with the second workforce or the second task group. If you are supporting the workforce in Vermont, what are your plans for the workers on dairy farms, the farm workers, especially given President-elect Trump's plan to deport undocumented workers? And let's see, I do have a third question, but now I'm not seeing where I had bold-faced it. But
that's fine. We can circle back, Molly, too. I think those are two really good ones, and I appreciate you putting them on the table. And we can, because we're a relatively small number of folks here, and I'm not seeing a ton of hands, I'd be happy if subcommittee members want to jump in and try to respond or help provide a little bit more understanding what's going on in the subcommittee on these, for instance, these two topics. Thanks, Molly. So I'm wonder, Jael or anybody else in the subcommittee, when you think about the term agroecology, when you think about the way your workforce issues are being addressed, what are the kinds of conversations that are happening right now? And just to give a little more flavor of what's going on.
Yeah, those conversations haven't specifically happened in the subcommittee, though they are happening in other agricultural circles around the state, and we definitely need to merge those kind of different groups together. But I think though we haven't specifically used the word agroecology, I think a lot of what we are looking at in terms of resilient agriculture just by nature is going to have to basically mimic those practices, agroecology practices, to create that resiliency. And then, yeah, I think as a state need to look at how, I mean, it's not only our dairy farmers, it's our big vegetable farmers are using immigrant labor, and how are we going to support that workforce and protect that workforce from deportation? And, because it's also going to support our farmers in continuing to do that work. So that's definitely, thanks for bringing that to our attention, and we'll incorporate that. I mean, we are looking at addressing, equality issues and equity and equality. So that definitely fits into that discussion.
Thanks, Joe. And Molly, do you remember the third thing?
I did. And Giles, thank you very much. I'd recommend that you contact the Institute for Agroecology. Great research that's been done on increased resilience, increased success with climate adaptation and climate mitigation on agroecological farms. So the research is there. They just need a little more support, a little more visibility. And the third thing that I wanted to ask about was whether you have any new ideas for improving land access, because that's still a huge problem for beginning farmers and for older people who want to go back into farming, and having more farms would definitely increase the amount of carbon sequestration. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Molly. Appreciate those thoughts. Again, subcommittee members, task group members, if there's some thoughts that you have, if land access has come up, shout out. I will just note as well the where we are in the process, and Jael mentioned at the top, but this subcommittee, along with the other substantive ones, are going to be presenting recommendations to the council on December 16th. And so these weeks are really important weeks of really trying to get these last ideas settled in. So it's really helpful to get feedback like this now, because there's still time ahead of the turning in these recommendations in December.
Yeah,
All right. Yeah,
just a
Jake,
quick
go ahead.
chime in on the farmland access. It is a strategy that's been identified, and I think the devil's in the details a little bit of the directive that we can provide in this work to how to enhance or increase access. There's a lot, there's a lot of work happening outside of this subcommittee and the climate specific work to identify ways to support shared ownership models that are emergent around the state. So to the extent that we can incorporate, and signal like how to support that work, we will. And yeah, I'm just glad you've raised that, and make sure that we also prioritize that as something that we're signaling through this process.
That's great. All right, I see a few more hands, and I also, since watching some things in the chat, I'll lift those up in a moment. But Graham, go ahead. Go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, thanks, folks. Graham Unang-Struifenacht. I'm the policy director at Rural Vermont. I'm also a farmer here in Marshfield, Vermont, grass-fed beef cattle and other things when it makes sense. I guess I want to push a little into what you just said there, Jake, because you all said at the beginning that the subcommittees, the role of Vermont's natural and working lands and carbon sequestration, storage, climate adaptation, ecosystem and community resilience, and climate adaptation. So to me, like, we could give a pretty generous interpretation of what community resilience and climate adaptation look like. And I think when most farmers and farm workers and young farmers in particular are thinking about resilience, they're thinking about their bottom line. And there's an intersection with, ecosystem impact that we need to take into consideration. But when we're thinking about the future of climate change, like, yeah, ecosystems are one thing, but we really need to consider what Molly was just saying there, I think, in land. Like, I think land is the big question. I mean, we have the New England Feeding New England projections of needing what, hundreds of thousands of more acres of land in production in New England to even meet 30% of our region's food resilience by 2030. And farmers can't even, young farmers can't get on land. They certainly can't have long-term tenure or ownership. Most farmers are leasing land. You know, I've talked to a bunch of young farmers at different presentations in my work, and like they're trying to study agriculture, and I go, well, how the hell am I going to pay off my student loans? I'm trying to work at a farm. I can't make enough money on a farm to even save up for my own farm, let alone to pay off a student loan. I think so my bigger questions for you all is like, Molly brought up agroecology, and maybe you should be aware that terms like PES, nature-based solutions, offsets, net zero, these are internationally defined programs and paradigms which are recognized by international agroecology movement folks as false solutions, in particular, you know, from this community. Agroecology is not just practices, it's a politicization of farming, and understanding it fundamentally, it's about human rights, rights of peasants, food and land sovereignty, community control over resources over time. And some of these big international climate agendas are really threatening those things. So I would encourage you all to really look at these land questions as fundamental to your task going forward. It's about community control over resources. Someone mentioned a food sovereignty plan and want to hear, but like, I guess I'm curious what the details of some of these things are. You talk about securing food security. You know, climate change is also like longer, more sustained power outages, being cut off from global supply chains. And in places where you've seen that happening, we're talking about communities having to learn how to use draft animals again, having to figure out how to create their own power resources and fuel sources. So I guess I'm just, I have a lot of comments I could make. Like I think the greenhouse gas emissions inventory is inherently flawed. And like this whole idea of net zero is really problematic. And, you know, all the electricity emissions in Vermont right now are now supposedly offset by renewable energy credits, the very same ones that are bringing multi-state operators in here to displace farmers by taking the land for that stuff. So we need to be thinking critically about like eroding carbon markets. Like some of these concepts are not going to meet our needs. They're going to further entrench problems. And climate change is an equity issue. It's not an ignorance issue most of the time. And it's a structural power issue. And I guess that's why land is the basis of like so much of this conversation. And I'm curious about like recommendations around regulatory solutions for land, bringing it more from a capital-based system to like a community rights and community sovereignty-based situation. What do we have in play? Like, you know, it seems to me like a lot of the work is based on this greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And I would really encourage you all to look at some of these larger directives you're all getting and think about it as holistically as possible. Maybe I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Graham. That's a lot. And I appreciate all those comments. You know, I know sort of that second task group is all about sort of the sustainability and resilience of farmers in the forestry sector. And I think these kinds of comments are really helpful in shaping that. Let's take a few more comments, and then I will encourage subcommittee members if you want to reflect on some of the things you're hearing. But let's go over to Chris Smith, and then Chris, go ahead.
Thanks, David. My name is Chris Smith. I work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I head up their private lands program. Been working with private landowners, mainly in the agricultural and forestry sector for the last almost 30 years to do habitat restoration. Many of these practices or activities on private land are benefiting a whole host. Many fit into the climate categories. Couple things that I guess that I would put out there. One, I think that there is still tremendous opportunity to do this type of work to benefit climate with some of the existing programs. I mean, to Graham's point, until we change the system and have something different to work with, there are programs in place that could help landowners to achieve multiple opportunities with this. And the second thing I would mention is somebody who's been kind of working in the restoration world, nature-based solutions, whatever term we want to use, moving to some of the traditional knowledge, the indigenous knowledge around ecology. I think that there needs to be some way to crosswalk that between what we're doing now and what those traditional techniques look look like or are in order to really make any progress with those. So those would be my couple comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Really thoughtful. Appreciate that. Nathaniel?
Yeah, my name is Nathaniel Johns. I'm the Clean Water Program Manager at VHCB. And I completely agree with everything that the subcommittees presented today. I want to echo the importance of managing riparian lands for flood resiliency. As we all know, extreme flood events have been increasing in Vermont, and unfortunately, that's a trend that's unlikely to change anytime in the near future. But I really believe that one of the best investments Vermont can make for both flood resiliency and water quality is providing farmers with adequate compensation to get agricultural production out of the floodplain. At VHCB this year, we provided funding to Fish and Wildlife to acquire some agricultural floodplain parcels, which will now be managed for wildlife habitat and flood resiliency. So yeah, I'm glad to see that and just want to echo that sentiment.
Thanks. Appreciate those comments. Ryan, jump in, and then let's do some conversation around some of the things we've heard.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to build off of Graham's invitation to look at challenges we're dealing with from a holistic lens. And I appreciate, Nathaniel, what you raised about floodplains, right? That is a major focus for the intersection of a lot of the flooding we have seen and will see in the future and food production. And the perspective I would want to just introduce to that line of, we got to get farmers out of the floodplain. Agriculture came from floodplains, right? That's where the most productive soils are. And balancing loss, indemnity, environment with the need for, productive food production. And, in the 2.5 years before July of last year, it was a significant drought. And so irrigation is going to become a management practice that farmers are going to have to utilize more, and proximity and access to rivers are a major, land right question where you can get your water in Vermont. And so just in this conversation, I think there are absolutely, and farmers know, those fields that flood too often to be, as someone else mentioned, economically viable. Farms being viable is a major question, and how do we keep food production happening in a changing climate? But just to throw out there, part of the conversation is, you can get 3 to 5 times the production in the floodplain and you can't upland. And so we're very forested state. And so where is this magical farmland going to come from? And so, especially in the context that we have to increase by 550,000 acres to go from 21% food production in New England to 30%. That's doubling of Vermont agriculture. And so just trying to keep the perspectives of, acknowledging, yes, there's absolutely impacts in floodplains. It's also a significant resource for farmers. So just raising that perspective as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah. Mike, you're up.
Yeah, I put my comments earlier in the chat, but since it didn't seem to be getting any attention is why I raised my hand. So I'll just leave it at that. If people could just look back at the chat on my comments about solar siting and competition for agricultural land.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Mike. And I think it's one of the things that caught my attention in the chat, because indeed, I think there is some attention to it. I heard in Andrew's, I was looking at Andrew's slides, and that very last bullet in his slide is about this issue of renewable energy siting and the impacts on ag. So I think it is something that the folks are looking at. I'm glad you're emphasizing it in the chat, and how other states maybe have some thoughts about it.
Yeah. David, if I can share, I manage the Section 248 energy siting program at the Agency of Agriculture, which looks at primary agricultural soils that will be affected by energy generation projects, which include solar. And so this is absolutely a significant pressure, especially given the just awful agricultural economy right now. We have lots of pressures on farms, and Vermont has taken a number of policy positions that drives both housing construction as well as energy siting to be most economical way to do that is on a prime ag field. You don't need a permit to build when there's not a wetland or trees there. And so it's right for all of these other priorities, but at the base of our, civilization, we produce food in places so people can live in, concentrated, settlements. And so this is absolutely a significant challenge. And it's important to note that the programs that are in place now do not offer teeth, right? You can't say, no, this is such an important agricultural parcel. We should not put solar panels here. This is so integral to the agricultural economy and culture in this area. This is not a good use of our ag soils. The agency does not have the opportunity to say that, and fees are not attached to solar panels, much like Act 250 development projects are, even though they're very expensive installations. And so how do we balance the need for energy production, which doesn't, emit CO2? It's, as Andrew Milliken said, I think our parking lots and our built infrastructure are some areas we should look first, even though it is more cost effective. It is less cost effective in those areas. We have to, and I think many folks on this call are aware of, the food production is something we have to plan for, and we can't lose all of our best ag soils because you can't eat solar panels. And so that's my perspective on the energy siting conflict, which is real and is increasing in intensity and frequency of conversation. So thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Claire, you have your hand up. Do you want to jump in on something?
Hi, thank you. Claire Ireland, I'm with the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts, and I just had a couple of questions. Thank you for this presentation. It was really great. I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of other plans and initiatives that are happening here in the state of Vermont, and I just wanted to ask to what extent some of those plans were referenced in developing these priorities. I know 30 by 30 was mentioned, which is great, but I'm also thinking about clean water work through Act 76 and tactical basin plans and other sort of pre-existing statewide plans and initiatives. How many of those were referenced, and do you have a sense of the alignment of this initiative with those? And I guess also a sort of a second follow-up question with that is, sometimes when we develop these plans, we run into a problem with capacity in executing some of the action items that are called for. And I'm just wondering if you've had any conversations about that, and to what extent this plan would call for, directing funding strategically into pre-existing programs, or to what extent this would necessitate the development of brand new programs that would need to be rolled out at the state level. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. I saw Jake's hand go up with that, and it's a good time to invite subcommittee members like Jake and others if you want to respond to Claire's questions or other things you've been hearing. Jake, do you want to jump into this?
Yeah, so just to respond to Claire, and I'm sure there's others who have more to provide on sort of the water quality specific alignment components. But I will say from the perspective of our subgroup looking at these issues of viability and technical assistance support, that we are definitely prioritizing strategies and actions that are looking to enhance existing programs and organizations and delivery mechanisms. I think this is something else that we've talked about as a full subcommittee, that we feel like we really have a strong system, a service provider system in place, and that a lot of the times the issue comes down to under capacity. And anything that we're developing here implies an additional level of service or expertise, and we definitely need to fund that at the appropriate level. So the conservation districts, for instance, are named in one of our actions as a specific entity to provide increased funding for. And then just from my perspective on alignment, and then I'll let others share on the water quality piece, but there's absolutely, we have absolutely, in the first iteration of developing the climate action plan, this subcommittee was very conscientious about including strategies, recommendations from other resources to integrate and ensure that alignment that, across these different plans that we're saying the same things. We're looking to elevate and prioritize, strategies that are going to be most impactful, most strategic. So I think that has definitely, from my perspective, been a big part of how we've approached this prioritization process and the development of pathways, strategies, and actions.
Thanks, Jig. That's really helpful background on what's going on in the task group and the subcommittees. Ryan, did you want to jump in on the same topic?
Yeah, just wanted to acknowledge, incorporated by reference are, of course, the water-based priorities. The main fulcrum for getting funding to farmers to implement conservation practices that have co-benefits for climate resilience and greenhouse gas mitigation is the water quality division at the Institute of Agriculture, and so representatives from that are present in helping to inform, how to deploy that in a way that is, of course, compatible with other, priorities in the environment, including other water quality considerations, et cetera. So that's definitely a foundation of the emission reduction approach.
Thanks, Ryan. And Andrew, I saw your hand go up on this too.
Yeah, I'll be really quick because I will echo what
You're muted, Andrew.
sorry about that. I'll be very quick because I just want to echo what Jake and Ryan just said, which is absolutely we should and will be building on all the work that's being done around water quality and all the organizations that are in place for that, and to have that really have a good intersection with all of our climate change actions. So that I'll leave it at that.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to jump quickly over to Nancy and then Graham back to you. Nancy, go ahead. And Graham, hang on just 1 second.
Hi there, Nancy LaRoe, NOFA Vermont Farmer Services Organic Practices team. And I just wanted one of the questions of who else should be heard from. And I just encourage you, if you haven't gotten very much farmer impact, just to continue reaching out to farmers to get their voices in whatever way is possible, whether it be surveys on like the Veg and Berry listserv, but it's they know what they need. They are good stewards of the land. That's what they want to be doing. It's the economic system that they're in is what is often the reason that they are not able to store the land as well as they want to, or they have to worry about just survival. So I would say make sure you hear from them. And also I just really want to impact the urgency of their viability. It's urgent. I mean, everything, climate change is making everything urgent. And with the last 2 years of flooding and the droughts before that, and just the impacts of COVID and all of the other things that are going on, like farms were barely viable before this, and they're becoming even more tenuous. And we want these lands to stay in production. We want them to be stewarded well. They are a climate solution as well as a food security solution and an economic vitality solution. So like there's a lot that rides on farms being successful. And so I just highlight the importance of that urgency in having them being able to transition out for older ones, young people getting onto land, and just being able to make a living is really important if we want the land to be doing the important work that it needs to do for mitigating and making our communities more resilient.
Thanks, Nancy. I really appreciate that. And I think it really speaks the importance of, as these recommendations get pushed up to the council, then the council reflects on them over the winter, staying engaged on like the detail of how all this shakes out. Like what is the detail that ends up getting proposed about farm viability and supporting farms? So I appreciate that. Graham, go ahead, please.
No, thanks. I mean, just a couple more things. I did want to share my appreciation for, I think, when I was originally involved in this process, agroforestry wasn't included as much in the incorporation of woodies, and I think that's an important thing to have in here. And I wanted to note that. I wanted to bring up a couple other things that I think could be in this committee's jurisdiction potentially or mandate. But Vermont Pension Investment Committee invested $100 million of Vermonters' pension in TIA Nuveen's global farmland acquisition subsidiary. So this is a global subsidiary that Vermont's invested $100 million in that's land grabbing around the world. This company has been found to be land grabbing in Harvard's endowments and others. I think that, if we're looking at the impacts in climate resilience and agriculture, hopefully our state's investments outside of Vermont are also being considered in that, and this being in the realm of ag. We have met with people from Brazil, with Beth Pierce when she was in this role and otherwise, and I think your voice would be really helpful to lending towards this process, and it could even push towards even more radical thoughts around this viability, like public banks, public banking, and other ways of generating our own income to support these farmers. I want to just underline the consideration of farmer and farm worker quality of life, healthcare, childcare, elder care, as we're thinking about climate resilience and things to think about going forward, mental health. I put this in the comments, but I'd be curious to know, Ryan, what the research looks like over time for agreed that historically the river valleys and these floodplains have been great places of agricultural fertility, but I'm really curious about what the testing over time for different chemicals and heavy metals and stuff that are now carried by these bodies looks like as they accumulate over time with repeated flood events, and how we may or may not be able to deal with those, or how that affects the nutritive value of food or potential contamination of food or livestock or otherwise. And the last question just for you all is I'd love to hear your thoughts on the education piece here. When you talk about integrate climate related education at all levels, and if that's climate related or if that's agriculture, like working lands, people are learning how to be foresters, people are learning how to farm, people are learning how to harvest wild foods and medicinals and make things out of them. What are we talking about? Because I think what was just said by Nancy was that the urgency. I just want to underline, I was talking with Nikki Lennart too the other day at Farm Viability Interview, and she's like, no matter how much money we can put at something, property values are beyond a lot of the financial help and the ability of people to access, period. And that's just the property values for new people, let alone people trying to survive in a really tough ag economy with floods, et cetera. So I just pushing towards what more dramatic steps can we take rather than continuing, yes, more TSP, of course, but what are more significant regulatory or other steps that we could take that really push the envelope more?
Thanks, Graham. I appreciate that sort of really setting a high bar here. Stephen, do you want to jump in?
Thank you, David. Thank you to everybody for showing up today and being engaged in these really, extremely vital issues for all of us. I wanted to just kind of speak a little bit more from my perspective as a farmer and not quite so much as a subcommittee member, and just more circling right back to where Molly started us with, if we are to affect a truly systems level transition of our agricultural sector to embrace agroecological principles and practices, we could make our existing agricultural acres wildly more productive than they currently are. And this goes to the New England feeding New England scenario of needing hundreds of thousands of more acres. And at the same time, we would be restoring soil health and biodiversity and addressing ecological overshoot, which is really, in many ways, I see greenhouse gas emissions as the symptom of our larger predicament as human beings of being in ecological overshoot with our habitat. But this kind of land caretakership of agroecological approach is much more labor intensive than the industrial agricultural model that even dominates here in this state. And it's going to require many, many more young people to join the cause. And if we're going to attract those young people and also people from the global south who will be coming here as their homelands become increasingly more difficult to survive in, they need to know that they can make a Vermont living wage doing this essential labor. And right now, many of our farmers have to go into debt just to keep operating. So that's why, as a subcommittee member, I continue to advocate for a UBI program, a universal base income program for farmers who adopt organic regenerative practices and soil health practices. And much of what Graham was addressing in terms of healthcare and dental care and childcare. These are all kinds of programs that could be built into something like a UBI, along with the technical service providers that we have and the uh, the many grants. And we could also institute things like uh, regional price supports and there. Just to say, we don't necessarily have to be talking about direct payments to farmers from the state. We can just really build out a lot of these supportive programs. And what we really need to do is just ensure that the farmers are making that Vermont living wage. So we're not talking about paying them a Vermont living wage, just looking at what through farm viability, looking at what they can do now and say, how do we get them to that next step? And in many ways, this transition to soil health practices in the long term should also improve the bottom line of farmers. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah. So one of the things we like to do as we get towards the end of these conversations is have everyone reflect a little bit about, what are some really core messages you want to make sure this subcommittee hears. So I'm going to throw in the chat a place to write a short phrase. There's been good information in the chat as well, but if you click on that link I just put in the chat, it's going to ask you to answer a question, right? The question is based on the conversation just now, like what we've been doing the last 45 minutes, hours. What is one piece of input that jumps out as particularly important for this subcommittee? Short phrase is great. I can even show what gets written as you guys start to write things. I apologize for some background noise here. But I'd invite everybody on this call to just take a moment and write a short phrase based on what you're hearing and what you're thinking and what you know. Just write up something. I'll start to share it as things come in. Let's give just folks a moment to write. And let me know if you're having trouble with the link, if it's not working. So you can start to see what I'm seeing on the screen here, what you all are writing. I encourage everyone to do. Take a moment, just write a phrase, something you really don't want this subcommittee to forget from this conversation. Obviously, we're taking notes. But feel free to write a few things. Right, land access, support regenerative food production, right? Land access again. Land and soil quality availability. Think about some more mandates that could be done, right? Direct support, holistic solution frameworks, other kinds of support, tax breaks. So thanks everyone for taking a moment to write that up. I really appreciate it. Well, obviously this will be part of the notes as well. I think it's important just to name these big ideas that are coming out. All right, as we finish up, and again, I apologize for the background noise in my, any other ideas, comments, issues that we should bring up? Okay, so why don't we talk just a second about next steps? And Evan, there's a final slide if you want to pull that up. And just so everybody knows, I've been referencing it, Jael mentioned it as well. But the next steps for this subcommittee to finish up their work, present their recommendations in the form of those pathway strategies and actions in December. And then, here it comes. Thanks, Evan. And then the council will, over the winter, be trying to consolidate all these things from the different subcommittees and make a draft plan. And in March or in April, there'll be a public comment period on that draft plan before it's finalized on by July 1st. In the meantime, these are great ways to stay engaged. And we can throw these links in the chat. I know, Evan, if you're
you're capable of doing that, or I can try to do it on my end. But to stay signed up with the Climate Action Office newsletter, to go on the calendar and see when this subcommittee is meeting and other subcommittees are meeting. And you can, all these meetings are public. And there's a form as well. Oh, thanks, Liz, for putting the chat. There's a form as well, is that third bullet there, where if there's things happen in between these meetings, the ideas you want to make sure get pushed to the subcommittee, using that form is the way to do it, or to the council. So those are multiple ways to stay in touch on this, and we encourage you to do that. Jael or Billy, your two co-chairs, anything else you'd like to say before we finish up today?
Yeah, I would just like to say, I appreciate everyone's comments, and the presentation we gave was a very high overview. You can go on to the website and see kind of all the actions that we're looking at, and they do address some of these, but I appreciate the comments about looking at like land access and kind of more of the economic system that farmers are working within, and how can we support farmers better so that they can farm better. So I appreciate that, and I encourage everyone to send more comments in, because we will take those into consideration.
Thanks, Jael. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for their time and participating in the conversation, and to encourage you to stay engaged as this moves from the subcommittees onto the council when they deliberate over the next 6 months in updating the plan.
All right, folks. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Appreciate you being here. Really appreciate it. And as Billy and Jael say, stay in touch. There's multiple ways to do that. Take care. With that, we'll end.
All right. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.